Thank you, everybody, for coming. I've never been in this building before. Dana was telling me a little bit about its history, and in particular that this is the building where the movie *The Age of Innocence* was filmed. And now I can't stop thinking about these rooms in reference to Michelle Pfeiffer and Daniel Day-Lewis, feeling that we all should be wearing tuxedos and revisiting the Gilded Age. The American Gilded Age, that is. Juan Gabriel, thank you so much for coming here today. It's wonderful for you to come and make time for this event. I want to ask a sort of maybe a slightly strange first question. If you could describe where you came from to get to New York. I understand you've been here for a few days. Is that right? So describe where you came from, and if you could tell us maybe some some detail, or maybe something you observed or something, if there's anything notable about your journey to get to New York. So I understand you've been here many times before.
Thank you. Yes, well, thank you, first of all, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Daniel. And thanks to the American Society for having me. And Jess, for taking your time as a reader and a novelist to do this. Well, yeah, it's not my first time in New York. I came for the first time when I was 10, and I have been returning at least every other year. It's a city I like very much. It has a certain very exciting quality that really gets me going. And some of the books that have shaped my idea of what literature is have been written here. So I try to come as often as I can. This time I came from Colombian, which is not usual because I have only been living in my country for the last year and a half or 2 years. After spending 17 years abroad, I left Colombia when I was 26, in 23, in 1996. And this was for Paris, and then I lived for 13 years in Barcelona. Between Paris and Barcelona, I lived for 9 months in Belgium. Don't ask me why. Really, I can't think of any good reasons to be in Belgium. Yeah, I wish I could say that. Yeah, it would be much easier. But I've been doing all my traveling from Europe for the last 17 years, until a couple of years ago I moved back to Bogota. So this is where I'm coming from right now. From a very strange city which has changed dramatically since the year I left. The country has changed dramatically.
Right, you left not long after the death of Escobar.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. I left in 96. Pablo Escobar was killed in December of 1993. And when I left Colombia, the idea was very clear in my head that I was leaving because I wanted to become a novelist. And if you were a Latin American novelist, this is what you did. You left for Paris because that was possible. So that was like a walking cliche of a Latin American novelist. We have this very long tradition in which the great novels about Latin America have all been written outside of Latin America. So the best Colombian novel was written in Mexico, 100 Years of Solitude, and the best Peruvian novels by Mario Vargas Llosa were written in Paris or in London, and the best Mexican novels were written in Washington or London. So this is what I thought I should do: live in Paris, go to Paris, become a writer in Paris. So yeah.
So to get here from Bogota, is there a direct flight, or do you go through Miami, or how do you?
There's a direct flight. Yes. I did go through customs. Yeah.
You traveled through the state of exception, and you got here.
Well, this may not be the place to discuss this, but after 9/11, I began being stopped at American airports because my name is apparently the exact same name of this Mexican drug dealer. So I knew what I have since known as the room. I know what the room is about. And I kept asking the authorities on the border, why, if this happened to me last year, why aren't you able to strike my name off the list? And they said, well, for every time you come in the States, we will strike one of your aliases. I said, I have no aliases. Oh, no, I'm sorry, the drug dealer has some aliases.
Right, okay.
So,
Okay.
but yeah.
Wow, amazing. I didn't want to begin an interview with you by asking about Garcia Marquez, but then he died. I don't mean to be flippant about that. I'm sorry if that sounded flippant, but it's on everyone's mind. And last week, when his death was announced, El Diario in New York City, the leading Spanish language newspaper, as I understand it, had a 7-page spread. That's it.
Yes.
Yeah. It said Gabo Vive on the cover, and an amazing spread. And I don't read Spanish well enough to follow the newspapers, but or not very often. But I bought it, and because I was amazed that any novelist would get 7 pages of coverage in a tabloid newspaper with photos and all these different articles about all aspects of his life. And the first article, not surprisingly, started off with the phrase Colombiano Universal.
Yes.
El llamado Colombiano Universal. And I just want to ask you, perhaps not even in relationship to his own work, or just as a general idea, what resonances do you hear when you hear the phrase Colombiano Universal? That is Colombian universally. There's lots of ways you can translate that.
Yes. Well, I think it's quite accurate. I mean, I think, and this is not a Marquesian hyperbole, I do think 100 Years of Solitude is the most influential book in the Spanish language, second only to Don Quixote, maybe, in the history of Spanish literature. And I think this is something that we can all see if we take into account the breadth of novelists who have accepted, who have confessed to the influence of Garcia Marquez outside of the Spanish language. I mean, Salman Rushdie, Toni Morrison, Mo Yan in China, Chinua Achebe, Peter Carey in Australia. All these people have said that their literature would be different or maybe non-existent if they hadn't read 100 Years of Solitude when it was published in English in 1970, 3 years after the original Spanish edition, or rather Latin American edition. So this is really one of the most influential novelists in the 20th century, and one of the two most influential novelists in the history of the Spanish language. You cannot diminish that. You cannot. It's an amazing thing that this guy was born in a small Caribbean town of a couple thousand people, or I don't know how many people were in Aracataca in 1927, but it was a few thousands. And he was able to model the idea of what Latin America was for several generations in the world, for several European, American, Asian generations. their idea of what Latin America was identical to Macondo, to what Macondo was. And the idea of magical realism was, for all these generations, the only way to look at the Latin America for many, many years. This is one of the things that many Latin American writers have tried to fight against before my generation. When it came to us, we no longer needed to fight against this idea because the magical realism had already become one of several ways to look at the world that had come out of Latin America, but not the only one, right? When I have to confront the idea of Garcia Marquez as an influence, I'm often asked the question, how do you write after him? How do you write about Latin America after such a powerful configuration of the Latin American landscape? And I usually say that that question springs from a kind of misunderstanding, in a way, because it supposes that literary influence works in a territorial way. So that if I'm a Colombian novelist, I have necessarily to have received the influence of the last great Colombian novelist, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And this is just not true. One of the wonderful things about literature is that you build it, and this you know well, you build it with whatever comes handy, and it doesn't have to come from within your own nation or your own tradition or even your own language. And the first case in point for this is Garcia Marquez himself. When he was beginning to write novels, there was no novelistic tradition to speak of in Colombia. He didn't have any novelists in Colombia to build on, to stand on their shoulders and build his own work. So he began by imitating Kafka in his first stories, and then he discovered the American novelists, the great American novelists of the early 20th century. And so he began imitating Faulkner, Leaf Storm, his first novel, The Leaf Storm, I think it's called in English, right? It's a very brash imitation of Faulkner. And then he went on, he got tired of Faulkner, and so he hired Hemingway, and he did his Hemingway novel, which is No One Writes to the Colonel. If you look at it closely, No One Writes to the Colonel is like a Caribbean Old Man of the Sea. It's exactly the same thing. There's an animal, strongly symbolic, and there's an old man, and he loses in the end. So if he was able to do that without anybody saying, how dare you try to build your own books outside of the Colombian tradition, well, why shouldn't I? So the books that were important for me as I was developing as a novelist were mainly written outside Colombia. Books by Mario Vargas Llosa, who's a Peruvian, or Philip Roth, who's an American, or I don't know, goes all the way back to Joyce, Flaubert, Conrad. Yeah. But here, I think he is the most influential writer in our language, and I'm incredibly grateful to him for his books. One of the 2 or 3 books that made me want to become a writer was 100 Years of Solitude. So we're mourning him right now.
Which you read in high school or college or?
Yeah, I was 16 in high school. Yes.
Is it taught nationally?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a foundational text.
Yeah. Yes. Well, Garcia Marquez won the Nobel Prize when I was 9, and he instantly became this sort of living classic. Yeah. His books were taught, even the bad books were taught in school. And when I read 100 Years of Solitude, he had been a Nobel Prize for 6 years. So he was already this kind of institution.
Had this aura.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I read that phrase, Colombiano Universal, I mean, I was thinking about your work and thinking about this interview, and the resonance that came to me was something quite different, because I sort of detached myself from thinking about Garcia Marquez for a second, and I was thinking about the Hotel Nueva Europa in The Informers, because I mean, if you think about that phrase literally, Colombiano Universal, in the Hotel Nueva Europa, this is a place where Colombia meets Europe, and where Europe is reconstructed in Colombia. So it's a very literal sense in which it's Colombia to the world.
Yeah.
But it's also what struck me about thinking about this aspect of it is, and you know, what you're talking about in a sense is a kind of literary cosmopolitanism. In the something that seems to me to be a thread that goes throughout your work, and especially in The Informers, is when we look at the Hotel Nueva Europa, it's a place of what we might call negative cosmopolitanism, where you have people from all over the world who are all guests, who are all treated the same way, but they're treated that way because certain questions are never asked.
Yes.
And certain statements are never made. Certain accusations, which are obvious, are never made. And I was, my question about that is really just an observation, but also, in a sense, a question, because it seems to me, looking at The Sound of Things Falling and The Informers, Bogota seems to be, this is a place I've never visited, but it seems to me in your description a place where that same kind of negative cosmopolitanism really has taken root in a certain way, in the sense that there's this avoidance of asking difficult questions, whether about the pre-World War II history of Colombia or about the Escobar period, and that, you know, what happens in your novels is this need to go back and ask the questions that really ought to have been asked many years before.
Yes.
Does that make sense to you, that
Yes.
formulation?
Yes, it does. Yeah. Well, this hotel Jess is talking about is one of the places where The Informers, an early novel of mine, is set, and it's based on a fictitious. It's a fictitious place based on an actual place that existed near Bogota in the 1940s, after the Colombian government broke diplomatic relationships with the Axis, with Germany and Italy and Japan, and began, as part of the effort, you know, the Allied effort in the war, began trying to control enemy citizens, Nazi sympathizers and fascist sympathizers and propagandists, of which there were many in Colombia, because it was a very important area during the war in Latin America, I mean, because it was next to the Panama Canal, and if that fell into the hands of the Nazis, it wouldn't have been nice. And so Colombia began confining enemy citizens in certain hotels. Things went wrong, and soon the authorities in Colombia were not only persecuting Nazis, but also any German citizen, including, this was the most absurd part, including Jewish escapees, because they had a German passport, because they had the passport of the enemy. But before these places were turned into this kind of camps during the war, they were hotels in which people from all parts of the world met in Colombia. I think one of the reasons I write, I often say, and this is something I have said in the U.S., so forgive me if you've heard this before, but I have a very few interesting ideas, and this is one of them. I think one of the reasons novelists, we usually think novelists write about their birthplaces or their countries because this is what they know well. And so Joyce writes about Dublin, and Philip Roth writes about Newark, and Saul Bellow writes about Chicago. And this is because these are the places they know well. And I've realized, or I think I've realized, that the real reason is that these are the places that are unpredictable to them. These are the places that are surprising because you think you know them, but then, I mean, you've grown up in these places, as I did in Bogota. I grew up in Bogota. I thought I knew the city well. I thought I knew my country. I thought my country had no secrets for me. And then I have this conversation with a German Jewish escapee who tells me that her father was almost locked down in one of these hotels built an hour from Bogota because he had a German passport. So the surprise that this had happened so close to my home, without me having the first clue about it, this is what moves me as a novelist. This kind of revelation, revelation of how little I know about my own surroundings. I began to understand this, and I began to understand how should I write about my country when I left. And this is when I get to your question. Leaving Colombia in 1996 gave me a whole other perspective on the country. It allowed me to understand that I didn't know enough about this country. This was the first stage. And the second stage, that this was not a problem from the novelist's point of view. That I shouldn't feel impeded to write about my country because of the fact that I didn't know my country. That the fact that I didn't know my country was the best reason to write about it. Because writing is an act of discovery. Writing is an act of writing novels is an act of discovery. Every novel is a very sophisticated question that you ask. And so my relationship with my subject and my country and the questions I ask about my country came through that cosmopolitan way of looking at it. I mean, a way of looking at it that stems from the 3 or 4 countries I have lived in, several cultures, several ways of life. And I think in some part of what I've said, there's an answer to your question. I just don't know exactly where, but you know.
No, I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. Well, it's one thing that seems very interesting to me, and this is something that you talk about in your essay on Garcia Marquez, El Arte de la Distorsión.
Yes.
You talk about how Garcia Marquez is traditionally thought of as a magic realist whose work detaches itself from any normative notion of history or especially historical specificity. But then you go on to talk about this reference in 100 Years of Solitude to the 1928 United Fruit Company massacre of banana workers who were striking.
Yes.
And it seems to me in your own work, there's a great deal of interest in historical specificity, and also a great deal of historical specificity.
Yes.
So I don't know if this is true of the Spanish language edition of the Informers. It may not be necessary, but in the English language edition, in the back there's a little glossary of helpful names and dates in recent Colombian history, so that so you're not relying on the English language reader to use Google to find out who Gaitan was, for example. They have it there, and it seems very striking to me that there's this, for any novelist dealing with questions of culpability or questions of blame, questions of who actually did something in the past. You have this essentially you're in a sort of bind. You're not doing historical research. You're not writing nonfiction.
Yeah.
And you also are in a sort of privileged position in that you don't actually have to get the facts right.
Yes.
But your narrators, and obviously you as an author, do care about getting the facts right. So this is it's very striking. I mean, it seems to me to relate directly to what you were just talking about leaving Colombia and realizing the things that you didn't know.
Yeah.
You know, the sense of you know, when you're talking to some elderly relative about the past, and they start telling you this story that they've told many times before, and then you ask them, but, you know, is that really true? Last time you said it was different, something like that. You know, you're being inconsistent. Yeah. And then there's a moment in The Informers where the father, Gabriel Santoro, tells the son, Gabriel Santoro, you've done this unforgivable thing by telling the story of the past. And he essentially says, your job is to shut up.
Yeah.
You know, your job is to not ask questions.
Yeah.
One thing that was very striking to me about that moment in the novel was that it was actually kind of persuasive. You
shut up. Yeah.
You did a good job of making me feel as a reader that the father really had a point. You know, he's like this old man. He's having this heart surgery, and the son has come into his life asking all these impertinent questions about things that happened 40 or 50 years before. And you see the whole fabric of the father's life being disrupted by these questions.
Yes.
Is that something that has actually happened to you when you're as a Colombian novelist writing about very painful parts of Colombian history? Have you had people say to you, why are you doing this? Why does it matter so much to you?
Oh, yes, yes.
Why not write about the present?
Yeah, yes, I have all the time. And particularly with The Sound of Things Falling, which is deals with a subject we Colombians are still uncomfortable with. The public image of Colombia in the last 20 or 30 years has had a lot to do with the drug wars and drug trafficking. And for many Colombians, still the best situation would be that novelists and journalists and essayists just shut up about it and stop contributing, as they see it, to the negative image of our country in the world, which is something I cannot bring myself to agree with, because that would mean forgetting about certain things that have happened, and that is just not what I believe is right. What you were referring to has a lot to do with my idea that these are not novels. The Informers and The Sound of Things Falling are not novels about history. I don't see them as novels about history. I see them as novels about memory, about the act of remembering. And this is an essential thing in literature. W.G. Sebald, a great German novelist who died in 2000 prematurely, used to say that memory is the moral backbone of literature. This is something I could, write down in a little card and stick to the walls of my studio. This is one of the best things literature does. It remembers. It remembers what everybody else wants to forget, particularly in countries such as mine and as other countries in Latin America, where that story we call history is often manipulated by those who have the power to do it, so that it tells a false version of what happened, or a version which has its own agenda. But for a very long time, I think since we became independent countries, we have been asking the question, who should have the right to tell this story? Who should have the right to impose on us their own version of how things have happened to us? And all the big powers, all the powers that be in Latin America, all those words we write with capital letters, the state, the government, the church, whatever, have been competing for the right to tell their own version or to impose their own version of how the Second World War happened in Colombia or how the drug wars happened in Colombia. And one of the great things novels do is try to claim that right for us, for the citizens. Try to recover the right to tell our own story, or at least to remind everybody that things could have happened in a different way. Carlos Fuentes says in Terra Nostra, which is a wonderful novel, but very difficult, so nobody reads it anymore. But it's a wonderful book. And he has this passage in which there's this medieval invention called the theater of memory. And somebody in the novel says that in relationship to this theater of memory, which projects onto a wall everything that happened in the historical past, but also, and this is the great part, everything that could have happened. So he says, the novel says rather, this is what literature does. Literature not only tells us things as they happened, but also as they could have happened. And in doing this, it enriches our sense of possibility, our sense of how we work as societies. But it also affirms our right to tell a different version than the one who is that is being told by the powerful, right? So this is my relationship with the Colombian past. I try to write books in which things happen in a different way than is usually known in Colombia. I try to write books that bother people, that are uncomfortable, because I believe I'm writing about difficult truths or things we had forgotten, conveniently so, right? This is one of the great things about literature, and this is what my favorite American novelists do, for instance. Again, Philip Roth, Don DeLillo. These are people who take a look at the past and they try to surface some very uncomfortable truths for us to look in the face right now. And this is very useful. Not that literature has to be useful in any sense, but, you know, it is.
You know, if you look at The Sound of Things Falling, and if you look at a lot of literature of Latin American writers, if you look at it from even a slightly transnational perspective, you also see that the narrative of the United States is told in those books as well, whether you're talking about the United Fruit Company, or in the case of The Sound of Things Falling, the fact that American Peace Corps workers were involved in the early development of the drug industry throughout Latin America. It seemed to me that there's a really extraordinary moment in The Sound of Things Falling, where the young American woman Elaine Fritz has married this Colombian man and is living in the countryside. She's a former Peace Corps worker, and her husband is a pilot. And there's this moment where he's been flying Colombian marijuana to Florida, and then and making a lot of money, and they have a good life. All of a sudden, they have this house. They have this amazing, for a former Peace Corps worker, she's living in the lap of luxury in rural Colombia. And then her husband comes and says, and says, there's this thing called coca paste, and these other Peace Corps workers are teaching the farmers how to refine it into this luminous powder. And you think we're living well now, you have no idea. You have no idea how much money we could make. And you see in that moment, in that conversation, you see how the history of Colombia and the history of the United States are so completely intertwined.
Yes.
Because that moment transformed Colombia, but it also transformed the United States. In a sense, it transformed the world. But in a very, it was that moment, it was those decisions by those actual historical people
Yes.
that gave us Scarface, that gave us crack cocaine, that gave us the America we know
The
today.
Wire.
Yeah, that gave us the cocaine world that we live in today, socially, culturally, psychologically.
Yes.
And it's an amazing thing to see that tiny seed, which was a very real human moral decision.
Yeah.
And how amazingly, almost inconceivably vast, the consequences of that decision.
Yes, this is one of the things that became very interesting for me. To trace in the novel these little moments made of little people who take very small decisions and are shaping the world in which I grew up. I was born in 1973. This means 3 years after Richard Nixon said for the first time, I think, in a speech, the words "war on drugs," and 4 years after he closed the Mexican border so that marijuana wouldn't invade the U.S. Well, of course, marijuana consumers didn't stop buying marijuana; they just looked for somebody else to give it to them, right? And this is when Colombia comes in the picture for the first time. They discover this very high quality. I'm not too knowledgeable in marijuana, but apparently the Santa Marta golden variety grown in the Caribbean, in Colombian Caribbean coast, was a very powerful thing. And this is how the whole thing starts. Just because the American president at the time closes, or rather tries to break the relationship between American consumers and Mexican producers, well, they look for somebody else to deliver, and that's how the whole thing starts. This is 1970. The DEA was founded in 1973. In 1984, Pablo Escobar kills the Justice Secretary in Colombia, and by 1993 he had become one of the most dangerous criminals in the history of the world. In 10 years, there are at least 10,000 violent deaths associated with him. He had a whole country under his thumb. He killed presidential candidates. He paid what we call sicarios, the very young hitmen, to kill cops in the streets. Didn't matter what kind of cop, as long as they killed an officer of the law and brought the next day's newspaper as a proof, they got $2,000, I think it was, or something like that. He turned the whole country into this huge corrupted place, and drug dealing into the breeding place of the worst terrorism we have ever experienced in Colombia, and one of the worst in Latin America.
And also a forerunner of what happened in Mexico.
Yes,
20 years
exactly.
later.
What is going on in Mexico right now was predicted by Colombian columnists 15 years ago, because they saw it coming. Because it's so predictable as an industry, the drug industry, and our relationship to it is so predictable. So at one point, I began asking myself, what did that do to us as a generation? How did growing up during this time of violence shape our outlook on life, our way of relating to one another? I grew up, I was 11 when that first Secretary of Justice was killed. So I became an adolescent and then an adult at the same time that Pablo Escobar was each time dominating more the Colombian political and social landscape through violence. And I grew up in a city where everybody was afraid to go out, afraid of spending time in public places, because he was bombing shopping malls, because he was bombing civilian airplanes, commercial airplanes, I mean. So he turned life in Colombia into this uncertain place where violence could hit you anytime. And I was convinced this had done something to us. This had changed our way of living, of being in the world. And the novel is an attempt, is my take on it. The novel is an attempt to try to trace this, try to trace that process, or what it meant to us to live with fear, to live with the uncertainty of violence, with this unpredictable violence. And it turned out it's something that every Western country right now knows something about. When I went to Peru to talk about the novel, they said, well, you're describing exactly what was going on here at the moment of Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path. If I went to Ireland to talk about the novel, they would mention the IRA and the bombings in the 80s. The same thing for the Basque Country and Madrid under ETA in the 1980s. The same thing about Mexico right now. The same thing, about, in a way, post 9/11 New York. So this feeling of constant subdued fear, this feeling that we don't know what will happen next, is something we all share in the 21st century.
I was going to say in response to that too, that you and I are almost exactly the same age. I was born in 1974, and I grew up I was a teenager in Baltimore in the late 80s and early 1990s, the first time that Baltimore became the murder capital of the United States. And of course it was the murder capital largely because of the cocaine
drugs, yes.
trade. And I didn't grow up in a city where shopping malls were being bombed, but I did grow up in a place where every time you got into your car, you had to look in the back seat because the carjackers, people stealing cars would hide in the back seat and put the gun to your head. And this happened to many friends of mine. Virtually everybody I knew was affected by the continuous low-level violence
Yes.
that was mostly related to the drug trade. And in another, this is another way in which, one Colombian experience becomes a kind of, becomes bookended by an American experience, because that the cocaine highway goes straight up, from Colombia to Florida, straight up Highway 95 to where we are now, and that runs straight through Baltimore, my city, and that's it's like an artery.
Yes.
Literally like an artery. Like
plugged.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I mean, this is what I grew up with, and at some moment I realized that this story had been told many times. It has been told many times in the media, from an external point of view, if you will. I mean, you can all go. This is something that I have discussed many times. We can all go on YouTube and find, for instance, the actual video of Luis Carlos Galan's murder, presidential candidate who was shot and killed by Escobar's hitman in 1989. And on the internet you can find all the statistics of those years, the people killed, their political importance. You can see the debris of the airplane, the commercial airplane that was bombed in midair by Escobar to kill a presidential candidate that wasn't even there. All those photographs, all those images, we grew up with them, and they're available for everybody. But where do we go if we want to look at the emotional consequences of all that? Where do we go if we want to see what happened to us from a moral point of view. How did that shape us morally, emotionally? These were the questions that I needed to solve. And this is what fiction does. Fiction allows us to build this place where moral and emotional questions can be asked and solved. So you get the other point of view, the internal point of view. This is what I tried to do.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you particularly about, in your essay about Garcia Marquez, you used the phrase distorsión, the word distorsión, to talk about what you believe Garcia Marquez does that's not magical realism, but it's a kind of an alteration of history specific to the fiction writer. You know, distortion in English has a pejorative connotation. You know, if you say this is a novel that distorts history, or this is an account that distorts history, it implies a kind of a mendacity, a kind of an urge to alter something for some bad reason. I don't know, does the term distorsión in Spanish have that same pejorative meaning? Is there another English term you would use as an analog for the same? The effect.
This is something my translators would have to take care about. Yeah, take care of.
Good luck to them.
Yeah. Well, the whole idea behind that essay is that for me, I have this ongoing fight with historical fiction, because I believe in what Milan Kundera says in some essay.
In the Art of the Novel.
In The Art of the Novel, which is a great book, a beautiful book, The Art of the Novel. And Kundera says there are two kinds of fiction about history. One is historiographical fiction. That means fiction which takes a historical subject and just repeats it all over again, only with fictional techniques such as dialogue and description and maybe an interior monologue now and then. But it tells us things that we already know from history books, from great history books. On the other side, there are novelists who deal with the historical condition of man. That is, who reflect on the idea that history is a part of what we are, that we have a metaphysical relationship with the past, who reflect on the idea that history is, unlike this idea we grew up with, just one of the possible versions of what happened. That is, that what we think about when we think about history is a tale told by somebody. Somebody told us this thing. And that somebody had an agenda, had some prejudices, had a political point of view, was interested in suppressing certain facts or highlighting certain other facts. And the fiction that I like about history is the fiction that respects this idea, that doesn't try to do the same thing history books already do, that, in a word, tries not to be redundant, tries to give us something new. Kundera says at some other point, the novel's sole reason for being is saying what only the novel can say. That means not saying what history books say better, not saying what journalism says better, nonfiction says better, but trying to say things that only novels can say. Trying to get to that little corner of human experience that can only be explained through imagination and through the imaginative resources of fiction. So this means, in a certain way, the divine right of the novelist to change facts if it suits him, to build a new reality on known facts if it is necessary to take us somewhere else, to take us to some other revelation, to the third truth, as my friend Javier Cercas puts it. He says there are two kinds of truth: historical truth and poetical truth. Actually, it's not him; it's Aristotle, this young Greek writer you might have heard about. Aristotle says historical truth is what happened to one guy at one moment in time, at one place. Napoleon at whatever, Elba, whatever. Poetical truth, on the other hand, and this is what novels deal with, tells us about what happened to everybody at every place and every time. So it doesn't matter that the characters in 100 Years of Solitude are Caribbean and belong to the first half of the 20th century. They will speak to everybody everywhere. This is what fiction does. This is what every novel, every great novel, doesn't matter how local it is, tries to do. It tries to talk about everybody, everywhere, tries to get at those things that make us humans, those things that are, again, universal, as Garcia Marquez was called. I don't know where I was going with this.
Oh, it's good. It's good. Yeah. So I want to ask you one last tough question.
Okay.
If you're okay with it.
Yes, I'm up to it.
So you have, I mean, from the description of Las Reputaciones, it sounds like it also involves a detour into history, or detour into the past. So, can you imagine writing a novel, say, that deals with...
Oh, right, hold on.
Yeah.
I just forgot.
Yeah.
I realized where I was going with
That's
all
good.
that.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that sometimes novelists and great novels distort known reality because, not in the negative sense the word has in English, but just in Spanish as it makes something different from what it should be originally. Great novels many times distort known reality because that's the way to reach some revelation, to reach some truth that wasn't there in the first place and that couldn't be reached at by respecting facts as they are. So, for instance, in a novel of mine, The Secret History of Costaguana, there's a Colombian president who dies just after negotiating the Panama Canal Treaty. The Panama Canal and the separation of the Panama province from Colombia was a huge national trauma. It's one of the worst things to have happened to our country. And so in my novel, it's so bad that everybody who deals with the Panama Canal or the treaty dies afterwards. It's a comic novel, it's a picaresque novel. So this real Colombian president negotiates the Panama Canal and dies later. In reality, he died 20 years later in Rome, not in Panama. And at some point, I had the very bad luck of meeting his granddaughter, who really asked me, "Why did you steal 20 years of my grandfather's life? Why were you inaccurate? Didn't you have the documents straight?" And I had to explain that this was a poetical approach to his life, that I didn't care that he had died in the 1920s in Rome, because in my fiction, his death 20 years before, after negotiating the Panama Canal Treaty, underlines one of the metaphors in the novel, which is how bad this political situation was for Colombians. So this is what distortion comes to.
Yeah. So the question, the final question is, have you ever imagined writing a novel that doesn't go into the past at all? That is just a contemporary social farce, or just a romantic novel. Say a romantic novel. Have you ever thought about doing something like that?
Well, I began by doing that. My first book is a book of stories um, which will be my next published book in English, in America at least, that deals with the stories of people I knew when I lived in Belgium and France between 1996 and 1999. I met a lot of people. I heard a lot of fascinating stories about their present lives, their relationships, their failed relationships most of the time, their problems with love, with parenting, their problems with their own personal past, their own guilt, their own shortcomings. So it is a book very much about that present moment, very much about living in the Belgian Ardennes or in Paris, and meeting people and talking to them, and my fascination with other people's lives. My tendency to ask too many questions, if they let me, and to reveal their secrets, which is not something I'm proud of, but novelists do that.
And then suffer the consequences.
So I started by doing that, and it was after that book of stories that I, in a way, discovered how to write about the Colombian past, which had always bothered me, and that I discovered all the very subtle but very tangible links between Colombian history and Western history, and the U.S. in particular, which appears in all my novels. We have this very strong relationship, political and social. So I think if I began there, I might go back. Yeah, Reputations, which is my last published novel in Spanish, is a little bit about that. It's a novel about the personal past of the character and the problems he has remembering this very mysterious night he experienced 20 years before. But it's my first novel. It's the first novel of mine in which the subject of Colombian politics or history doesn't is not present.
Interesting. I think that's our This is the time for questions, and I'm
So-
not sure.
Yeah,
Do you
so
have a microphone to?
I have a microphone we can
use?
pass out if you'd raise your hand, and Jose can also pass out the microphone, and then we'll take
Hi
the
there.
question.
I have
Hello.
a question. You talked about great Colombian writers, obviously, Garcia Marquez. You're a great Colombian writer. I read your book last year. It was a revelation for me. It's a totally new voice, something fresh. But there's another writer that is Colombian that I love, and he died not too long ago, I think maybe a year, and that's Álvaro Mutis.
Yes.
And his character, Macrol el Gaviero, is amazing. And I was just wondering, what do you think of him, or what are your reactions to him, and is he an influence for you?
He's not an influence, and that is very strange because we share this passion for the same writer, Joseph Conrad. Álvaro Mutis was a very big fan of Joseph Conrad's novels, and the only time we met, we spent half an hour talking about Conrad and his novels about the sea and the idea of adventure in literature, which he advocated. He was very good at adventure in novels, and it is very difficult to write about adventure, at this time and place. But I have to say, despite my admiration for his novels, I always thought of him as a poet. I think Álvaro Mutis was one of the great poets in the Spanish language in the 20th century. He is amazing. His poetry is just out of this world. So this is what I go back to. I don't go back to his novels. When I learned that he had died, I went back to his poetry. I took a book of his poetry from my shelves, and I started reading that, because that's where I think he was most strong. But Macrol el Gaviero is one of the great creatures of Latin American fiction, right? One of the great inventions of Latin American literature in a century where great inventions were abundant in Latin American literature. So it's very good you brought him up.
Other questions? Raise your hand.
There's a great story. There's a great story about Garcia Marquez and Alvaro Mutis, who were very close friends, about Garcia Marquez struggling, trying to find his own voice, trying to do something new in fiction. He was living in Mexico at the time, and Alvaro Mutis comes to his place, opens the door, and just climbs the stairs running and throws a book at the table. It's Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo. And he says to Garcia Marquez, "This is how it's done, you silly." And this is the moment when Garcia, according to Garcia Marquez, he first read Pedro Páramo, which was a huge influence on 100 Years of
I
Solitude.
think you said he could recite it by heart.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very short, Pedro
Yeah.
Páramo.
Yeah.
That's
But
a novel that's almost
he was a
entirely
big liar.
unknown. He was a big liar.
He was a big liar, Garcia Marquez. So, don't take that.
Hello. I was
Hello.
wondering, I read that you translated some works from English into Spanish, and so
Yes.
I'm wondering how involved you were in the translation into English of your novel.
Very much. Yes, I earned a living as a translator for a while, for maybe 4 or 5 years. I translated books from English and French, and I still think the best way to learn how to write fiction is to translate. Because obviously we learn fiction by reading, right? And there's no better reader than the translator. No one reads as closely as the translator. So to learn all the little things that are happening in a novel, all the decisions, all the tricks, to learn which tricks not to use, the best thing is translating fiction. So yes, I was very much involved in the English translation as in the French translation. The two languages I can, have a sensible opinion about. And I started collaborating with this translator, Anne MacLean, with the Informers, and she has translated every book of mine since then, and this relationship has grown into a complicity. You say that exists?
Complicity?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Sure.
This very close relationship in which she knows everything that I like to do, that I hate in fiction. She knows all my literary values. And so she's able to do things I wouldn't allow anybody else to do. She's able to change things. Of course, she asks me after she does. Yeah. But she has learned that for me, one of the great values in fiction is euphony, is that things sound good. So if the literal translation of a sentence in which a character is wearing a pair of pants doesn't sound well, she said, let's give her a skirt, because this sounds better. And I tell her, yeah, go ahead, just skirt that girl. So we work really closely, and I feel about the English translation as good as I feel about my own original.
Yeah, I'm interested in the question of guilt.
Yes.
In Las Reputaciones, comes very strongly. And I'm just wondering about your generation and you having left, and kind of where do you have a sense that there is that guilt is a prevalent feeling among people of your generation, either both those of you that left and now have come back, and also those who have stayed?
Yes. I have thought about that, yeah. I mean, during the 80s, Colombia was such a difficult country that it became standard leaving, not staying. I mean, the default position was to leave, even if it was for Ecuador or Venezuela. It was such a difficult country to live in. There had been such a change in mentality. I mean, it's not only the violence. Pablo Escobar and the drug trade did something much more troublesome for Colombians, which is change their mentality. Garcia Marquez says at some moment in News of a Kidnapping that what the drug trade did essentially was convince young people that respect of the law was the shortest way to unhappiness. This is the mentality that was prevalent in Colombia in the 1980s. And this changed the way a whole generation thought about the country and about how we should live as a society. And this became unbearable for many people, so they left. I was one of them. As I said before, I thought I was leaving because I wanted to become a novelist. But I have realized that violence and that kind of weight of the years of the drug trade had a lot to do with my decision. And I know many people who feel guilty about this. I don't, but I ask myself the question all the time, why don't I feel guilty? Is it because I was living in this tradition of would-be novelists who try to look for somewhere else to practice their trade, to learn their trade, and they have this sort of impunity because of that, right? This sort of privilege. I don't know. I have never felt too strong about those big emotions that have been manipulated by Latin American governments for as long as they have lived. Those kind of empty nationalism. I have never felt. So I feel that if for a whole generation the road to a better life was to leave, it's good that they took it. Garcia Marquez died a week ago, and you would be surprised at the amount of writings and columns that have rejected celebrations because he was somebody that didn't live in Colombia, which is, I think, completely absurd. Nobody in the history of my country has done as much as he did for the reputation of the country. So this is where I stand in that sense. It is a conflict. It's always a conflict. Now that I have come back to Colombia, I'm always trying to think, why should I stay? Should I stay or should I go? Why should my allegiance to my country be measured by the place where I'm living? And isn't it true that your country is where you feel well at a certain moment in time? These are all very difficult questions, but I keep asking them. Yeah.
I have a crazy question, since you took Mutis from me. I was going back to Pablo Escobar,
Yes.
which was a criminal. He had many lovers, but he was a very dedicated family man.
Yeah.
And he died because getting in touch with his family, which
Yes.
he didn't have to. So you as a journalist, and you have a sensitivity, obviously, as a writer, what do you think is that tremendous difference in a man that's a serial killer, and at the same time, he's almost gave his life for his family?
Yeah.
I'm just curious what you think.
Yes.
Crazy.
Yeah. Well, I think he's a great subject for a novel. Only novels can get at the complexity of somebody like that. He was a psychopath. The recordings we have of his conversations with his lieutenants, there's a fascinating moment in which he says, we have to burn the city down. We have to bring total chaos to the city, so that we have to burn the politicians' homes down. We have to kill civilians as much as many as necessary. He says these words, so that the government will be forced to sit down with us and negotiate. Somebody who thinks like that is obviously a psychopath. But he would not be the first psychopath in the history of the world who has these very strong family feelings and who thinks that everything is justified in order to protect his family. I mean, I don't think these are contradictions, really. I think it's just part of the complexity of human beings. And it's part of the reason why writing these stories is necessary. Writing stories about Pablo Escobar, writing stories about mass murderers, that show that other side is frowned upon many times. I don't think it should, because it shows us that every one of us could become one of these guys. And this is dangerous, but this is very useful too. They are not exceptional people. They are not out of our species. They belong to the same species as we do. And this is what we have to face. This is a big challenge for us as societies, trying not to produce people like him.
Yes, Sorry. So, of all the places I've spent time, Colombia to me stands out, in part because it's so hard to pin down the truth there. It always feels like there are stories behind stories and strange interests that you can't quite put your finger on. And I understand why that might lead you to want to write fiction, but you also have a column in which you're commenting on politics and current events. So I'm curious, have you ever considered writing nonfiction books about what's going on in your country?
Yeah. Yes, I do have a column. I have a weekly column in which I try to deal with political subjects in Colombia most of the time, not all of the time. Sometimes I write about useless things like literature and the arts. But I think this is a very difficult. It leads to a very difficult stance in life, because the way a novelist looks at the world is the exact opposite of the way a columnist looks at the world. I've always said that. I said before that novels are big, sophisticated questions. This is what novels come from. Novels come from things that we don't know. I suppose it's the same with you. Novels come from questions you ask. And really great novels, never as satisfying as they may be, they don't give answers, right? This is something Chekhov said. Literature doesn't give answers. It tries to find the most interesting questions possible. So this is the ethics of a novelist. A novelist writes because he doesn't know. A novelist writes because he hesitates, because he has doubts, because he asks questions, whereas the columnist writes because he knows something, because he's absolutely sure of something, and he wants to convince you. He proselytizes. A columnist thinks, even if it is only during the time when he's writing the column, he thinks he has the truth on this subject. Drugs should be legalized, or whatever. And he tries to convince his readers that they should think this way. So there are two very different outlooks on life, and opposite, and they're in conflict. So this is very difficult for me. I live, and it's my natural outlook on life as a novelist. But one day of the week, I have to be sure of what I think. And so the stress this puts on me, the amount of information I have to have, I never write a column without either reading or knowing I have read an enormous amount of information on that subject, to try to form a very strong opinion on it, very solid opinion on it.
And is that how you divide your time? You have one day a week when
Yeah.
you write the column?
Yes.
Wow.
And my family hates me during that day.
Yeah, I can.
Because I become irritable, and I know in my heart that the whole tradition of the public intellectual in Latin America is weighing down on me. It's making me write about meaningful things of the present, making me take political stances, making me make enemies. And I have become convinced that the only reason I still have this column is to make more enemies. And every time I write a column,
leave Colombia again.
yeah, exactly. Every time I write a column and I don't get insulted, I feel I've wasted my time. Because this is what that kind of journalism is for me personally, coming from this tradition, Mario Vargas Llosa, Carlos Fuentes, Garcia Marquez in the 80s, to be outspoken about things, to say things that many people would like to say, but they can't because they don't have the space. So this very old-fashioned responsibility is something that weighs heavily on me. But it's recent. I've been doing this for 7 years, and it's not my default position. I look at the world as a novelist who doesn't know, who asks questions, who doesn't have answers. So it's very difficult to have that other personality rule for one day a week.
And this is something that American writers just never do.
It's
American
not in the
novelists.
tradition.
No, it's
And
not,
I
it's not in
envy
the
them.
tradition. It's almost impossible to imagine. What would
Yeah.
Jonathan Franzen's weekly
Yeah,
God,
exactly.
God help us that
Exactly.
such a thing could ever come to pass.
Or even somebody as political as Philip Roth.
Yeah, even
you can't
even
imagine him
even
writing.
more nightmarish for the American
Yes.
reading public. Right. It's So it's fascinating to contemplate. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I tell you, I feel that like this lady that maybe it's not right, but you made me angry. Sorry about that, but the thing is that I came from Argentina at a time of dictatorship.
Yes.
I am much older than you are, but the reasons seem to be always the same.
Yeah.
I mean, memory is one thing, and memory can be, as a historian, one way, as a politician, as an artist, as a physicist as I am. The question, when you say we are always questioned, the person that do the right thing is always questioning.
Yes.
And he doesn't say, I question because I am a writer. No,
Yeah.
you are a writer because you question.
Yes.
So that's my only contribution for today.
It's quite true. It's quite true. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I hope you agree that our understanding of the period of dictatorships in Argentina and Chile would be much less without fiction. It's
When I came here, and was the in the 70s, the boom,
yeah.
I said to every people, this is not magic realism.
Right.
This is the way we live in Argentina
Yes.
or in Chile or in whatever.
Yeah.
So, a lot of things are totally distorted.
Yes.
If you want to put the American use of distortion.
Yes.
Okay? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, shall we take one more question, or? Well, okay, one more question and then we'll wrap it up.
Hi.
Hi.
Good evening. Do you think that the column you're writing and the reactions you get from what you're writing could inspire you to write a novel about it, some fiction, for example?
I'm sorry.
About this?
I didn't hear you very well. Can you? Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. If about the column you are writing, the reactions you can get from your readers,
Yes.
either they agree or they don't, or they attack you or they don't. I know how polarized Colombia could be. Can inspire you to write fiction or novel about this. Do you think? Do you have that in mind, or maybe has occurred to you?
Well,
Because I know
in a way, that's exactly what I have done in the last novel. My last published novel in Spanish, Reputations, I think it will be that would be the title in English, deals with a political cartoonist in Colombia, living and working right now at the beginning of the 21st century. Political cartoons have a very long tradition in Colombia of influence, very strong political influence. Since the 20s, we go to political cartoonists as a sort of unofficial historians of political life in Colombia, and they're really very powerful and very feared by politicians and by public figures. I became interested in this subject, and I wrote a short novel about it, and I realized I used many of my own experiences and preoccupations as a columnist to build the character of this political cartoonist. He thinks more or less the same things I think about the role of public opinion, the role of writing opinion in a newspaper, about the very difficult relationship between readers and political commentators in Colombian newspapers. It's a very tense relationship. And somebody in the novel says that the Colombian opinion pages are like a huge the shrink's office, right? A huge shrink office for Colombian readers. This is the place where we go to know what we feel, to know what we think, to know what has happened to us. So yeah, it's all that you mentioned has become a part of the last novel.
Okay, I'd like to thank Juan Gabriel Vásquez and Jess Row for a terrific conversation, far-ranging, and exploring your various works in context. Thanks to all of you for attending. We now have a book signing. I'd like to ask your cooperation in please clearing this room, and I'm going to ask Juan Gabriel and Jess to please come to the book table. We have copies of Juan Gabriel's various novels, The Sound of Things Falling in translation by Emma Klein, and also the original in Spanish. We have copies of The Informers, which they also discussed, and Reputaciones, as well as Jess's books for sale. So if you do us the favor of please clearing the room, and then we'll form a line to come back in. We also have a reception in the Mexican room to the right of this room for members and VIPs. Thank you.
And I would like to say thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.